This is an interesting case in point. Time magazine, March 5th, 2012. Now, a big deal was made about this gentleman here, which I will be talking about a bit later. But I was more interested in what was inside the article. This particular cover was distinctive because it was the first time that Spanish was used instead of English on the main page. That was according to Richard Stengel, the managing editor at the time. Yo Decido translates into I Decide. It was all about the rise of political clout of Latinos. Now, inside this issue, they presented two charts showing the projected demographic trends out to 2050. You see it down there in the bottom right. But what struck me about the chart wasn't the growth of Latinos in the country, but rather it was the comparison of Latinos to other racial groups, especially since that is not how the data is collected. Note that their source here is the Census Bureau. It's mentioned here at the bottom. And they also note that Latinos can be of any race. Okay, they got that much right. But my attention then focused on the 2010 data that you see there on the left. I was looking at the percent of white people at 64% and thought to myself, that seems kind of low. You know, I tried to keep these numbers in my head, and at 64% didn't seem right. So I checked my census reports, and sure enough, there was the chart that showed the white population at 72%. See it right here, 2010, white population, 72%. So what happened to the 8% of white people? Well, I checked yet another chart and found that 53% of Latinos identify racially as white. Well, if you take 53% of the 16%, you get 8%. And suddenly, the alarm started going off in my head. Obviously, what they did is they took all those Latinos that marked their race as white and subtracted them from the white category to arrive at their 64%. That's essentially Time magazine telling people, all you Latinos that thought you were white, you're not really white, okay? Not so much. And note that the chart did not say non-Latino white. It just says white, okay? So what's going on here? Obviously, if you got someone that's Latino and you got them marking white, you have to make a decision. Are you going to count them as Latino? Are you going to count them as white? Are you going to count them as both Latino and white? Or are you going to count them as neither? In this case, Time magazine chose to count them as Latino and ignore their white identity. And you see this time and time again. It doesn't just happen in the media. It also happens with government agencies, such as the California Department of Finance. Now, in January of 2013, the California Department of Finance put out a much widely reported projection of racial demographics in California. Mainly the report stated that Latinos would become a plurality of Californians for the first time since California became a state. Now these are a handful of headlines grabbed online dating back to when that report was issued. Notice the commonality in the headlines being comparisons of Latinos to whites, just like we saw in Time magazine. Again, my racial identity alarms went off when I realized these stories, so I had to check out the actual report put out by the California Department of Finance, and this is what I found. To their credit, they reported data as non-Latino whites, and it was the media that simplified that down to simply whites. Still, their choice to create a Latino racial core category was still just as arbitrary. This is the actual data that they came up with in their report. Note that in each column, the racial identity is described as non-Latino. So we have whites non-Latino, blacks non-Latino, Asians non-Latino. Okay, every of these, even the multi-race category, they put down as non-Latino. In each case, they subtracted Latinos from all the other categories, thus lowering their numbers and boosting Latino as a percentage of the population. They also created a multi-race category. There is no multi-race category on the census, so this was created by the Department of Finance. And basically what they were saying to all the mixed race people is that, you thought you were still members of your ancestral groups. Well, not anymore. We're just going to count you as multi-race. So this, of course, added to the reduction of the other racial categories as well. And that's how basically Latino numbers were increased as a percentage. But what if we tried to correct for this? In other words, what if we let Latinos be white again? Here I've graphed the data as calculated by the Department of Finance. I only plotted the white and Latino populations just for clarity, then threw in the multi-race population just for fun. Note how the white population remains essentially flat for the next several decades, as does the multiracial population. On the other hand, the Latino population is just taking off. And if you notice right here, the Latino line crosses the white line, and that's roughly this year, 2014. So this was the year when Latinos became a plurality of Californians according to the Department of Finance. But as you recall, 53% of Latinos considered themselves white. So what happens if we add those Latinos back into the white category? Well, this is what it looks like now. As you can see, the white population jumps right up. They do appear to be converging, but they won't achieve parity, let alone take over in numbers. Latinos won't achieve parity or take over in numbers until well after 2060. So the purpose of this chart is not to present an actual prediction of future trends. Rather, it is to demonstrate how subtle changes in methodology can result in extremely different results. Who's to say who is right? Which methodology is more valid? Who is to judge? Ultimately, it is the consumer of the data that is responsible for judging what's right and wrong. That's you people. But if the data collection method is out of sync with how society constructs identity, what happens then? Well, it then opens the door for manipulating data.